Zoomers. I'm not going to define the word. Maybe everybody already knows its definition, but I will have our guest define it. We're going to be talking about looking ahead to the congressional elections, looking back at the most recent presidential election, and even prior to that, the role that younger voters had and might have again on recent American elections. To have this conversation with us is John Della Volpe, Director of Polling at Harvard University's Institute of Politics. He joins us today to talk about his book that's coming out, Fight, How Gen Z, that's the, I might even need a spoiler, that's the teaser, is channeling their fear and passion to save America. John Della Volpe, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, let's start by defining the word. Maybe it's obvious, but what is a Zoomer?
Well, Jefferson, a couple of hundred pages of text. There's only so many times I can use the word Gen Z. So I had to be creative, right? We use Gen Z, but we also expanded to be Zoomer. So Zoomer is also known as someone Gen Z, 70 million young Americans, born somewhere in the mid-1990s through 2010. I'm not someone, Jefferson, who puts hard and fast dates on when generations start and when they end. It's essentially this group of Americans coming of age over the last 20 or so years. Again, mid-1990s through about 2010 or so.
So say again the ballpark age range. And obviously it's like if you miss it by a month or even miss it by 18 months, it's not a strict line of demarcation. But nonetheless, it could be roughly useful to talk about. So ballpark age now of this generation?
Think about folks in their, fifth, sixth grade, all the way up to the mid-20s. Okay, so one way to think about this is the 2018 and 2020 elections had an increasing number of Zoomers or Gen Z in there, essentially Americans under the age of 25.
So we think about the generations that are participating now or alive now. Our oldest, they're still a few greatest generations maybe alive. The silent generation, is that most of our seniors now, and then boomers below them, then Gen X, then millennials, and then Zoomers. Do I have it about right?
Yeah, you have it about right. The way roughly I think about this, again, think about Zoomers under 25, millennials mid-20s to around 40, okay? Yeah. Gen X, early 40s to mid-50s. Boomers, mid-50s to about 74, 75 years old. Silent generation, including the President of the United States, mid to late 70s and older. And thankfully, we still have a few of the greatest generation still with us as well.
And even before, or even without doing large-scale psychography on each of these groups, just their scope, just their scale, the number of voters matters if we're trying to predict elections and understand who TV advertisers and social media targeters are targeting. Give us clumps, right? Like out of 300 whatever million Americans, how many are in each one of these generations now, give or take? You said 70 million Generation Z members. I think Generation X is the smallest generation, right? Is it maybe 40 million, something like that? Can you give us, what can you tell us about the ballpark sizes?
Roughly speaking, there's been so much written and talked about, right, about the baby boomer generation being the biggest generation of Americans. That would account for about 25% or so of Americans.
About how many people compared to 70 million?
Currently, it's about the same size actually. Currently, because some of them are passing away just because of age, right? Yeah. But the way to think about this is that baby boomers, the largest generation in the history of America, roughly we're about a quarter, 25% of all adults. The millennials, okay, we're actually slightly larger than that, a few million larger than that. And now we have Gen Z, which is probably 20 or so percent of all Americans currently. You have the combination, of course, of immigration as well as obviously births among some early baby boomers, late baby boomers, and Gen Xers, accounting for their parents.
And I want to correct myself. So I think I'm right that Gen X is the smallest generation. The delta isn't nearly as big.
Yeah.
Luckily, this isn't a statistician's show, but just want to get a sort of ballpark sense, what do we know about the voting behavior of Generation Z, of sort of the youngest voting generation who are starting to come? Maybe one operative fact is they're starting to come of voting age, right? Maybe half of them are now in voting age. What do we know about their behavior?
Two things really stand out, Jefferson. The first of which is, again, they've had two elections where they could participate. In both of those elections, young people, whether they're the Gen Z element of that 18 to 29-year-old cohort that we call young voters, or even those younger millennials, have broken modern day records of turnout and participation. What I mean by that is in the 2018 midterm elections, the number wasn't particularly high, but from the mid 1980s to 2014, only about 16% of young people turned out in midterm elections. So when baby boomers were young, when Gen Xers were young, and millennials were young, we had as few as 13 or 14% and as high of a number as 21% participate in midterm elections. When Gen Z entered the game in 2018, twice as many turned out as ever. Before, it was like 34%. Okay? In 2020, we had, for the first time, a majority of young people vote in the 2020 presidential election, 53%, more than when Obama was on the ticket. And the highest increases were among the younger Gen Z cohort. So what we know is that they are more politically active in that traditional sense of voting than any modern generation that we tracked, one. And in addition to that, which is also very, very important, they are more progressive and support Democrats in numbers of which I have never seen. For example, 70% of 18 to 29-year-olds voted for Democrats in the 18 election. 70%. 60% voted for Joe Biden in 2020, which is second only to Obama in 2008 in terms of over the last 20 years. So they're more likely to participate, and they're more likely to support Democrats. The context, when I started studying young voters in 2000, they were essentially 50-50. As many voted for George Bush in 2000 as Al Gore. In fact, there were older voters who were more likely to trend blue in those days. Again, back in 2000, a lot of those young voters were Gen Xers, like me. And we're just seeing the early millennials vote. So this kind of the cohort of young people have, over the last 20 years, have been more likely to turn out and far more likely to support Democrats compared to Republicans.
So, as you look at their voting behavior, not only where they check the box, but any exit polling information, any pre-voting polling information about attitudes, preferences, policy choices, are there? Presumably there are. What are some of the policy drivers? To the extent they're policy drivers, how much of that? Obviously, Donald Trump was on the ballot in 2020, was the president in 2018. The way when I was doing, spent much of my life, my adult life, doing young voter work, and the way I thought about young voters was less as a demography, was less as a clump of human beings merely, or much less an interest group, and more as a leading indicator, more as as a, a reflection of what was happening in the conversation, right? Like almost like lines around that age a tree. You can learn something about what's happening in the climate by looking at the tree rings. Is kind of how I think about it. But what do we know about their preferences? Why that 70% number in 2018? Why that near Obama number in 2020?
The single greatest predictor that I have found over 20 years of this research, Jefferson, is that young people participate, they vote when they can see a tangible difference in that particular action. This entire study, the book is a formulation of many, many studies and a lot of work beyond just the Harvard Youth Poll. But the Harvard Youth Poll started in 2000 as a reflection of what students on campus were talking about. And what they found was that seemingly everyone in this generation, or within this, certainly this college cohort, were volunteering in some significant way in community service. They cared deeply about their community and their country, and they were paying it forward. but they weren't as interested in voting. And that's why we began to study this subject. And what we found was that when people saw the tangible difference between a Democrat and a Republican, between participating and not participating, that's what drove turnout. And what happened was, for the first time, we saw 9/11. We began to see 4 years of increasing levels of participation. We had a similar 9/11 effect after Trump's election in 2016. We essentially had a 15-point attitudinal shift before and after Trump, and people saying, you know what, maybe I couldn't see the difference, that clearly between an institutional Democrat and Donald Trump in 2016, but I can now see America being pulled out of the Paris Accords. I can now see, immigrants not being allowed to enter this country based upon where they come from or their religion. I can now see border walls, being built. They could see the tangible. They could see Steve Bannon on the Security Council, right? They could see pipelines being built, et cetera. So they could see the tangible difference. That was one part, I think, of participation turnout. And the other part in 2018, frankly, is the March for Our Lives movement. You had a group of young Americans who, for the first time, challenged themselves, their community, and others if we were going to stop the heinousness of school violence and gun violence, that they need to take responsibility and stand up, empower themselves, their family members, and begin to talk to Congress and begin to participate. Those factors, tangible difference, as well as being empowered by March for Our Lives, I think were a couple of the most significant drivers in 18.
So back in the day, or even in another universe, one might look at and say, if my job is to win a majority of voters, and if there's a particular sector of voters I'm losing a lot of, then I have sort of a range of options. And the first one that might occur to me is go get more of those votes. Go appeal to, if they're critical issues, climate change, gun violence, our approach to race and equity in the United States. There's some sort of fundamental issues that seem to be critical to a block of voters, and I'd consider how I wanted to address that set of issues, right? Dwight Eisenhower is a Republican. I don't know, famously was quoted as saying, well, anybody who isn't for labor rights doesn't have a chance of winning an election. It's just sort of a silly thing to be. And that was him looking, okay, well, if we're losing labor voters by a lot, well, we should win labor voters. We should try to win more labor voters. It seems as though there's some other options, because it feels like, in terms of climate change, in terms of what's happening with wealth disparities, in terms of what's happening with sort of democracy, voter suppression, what's happening certainly with gun violence, the modern Republican Party is kind of locked in, right? Modern Republican Party, they're not, you're not winning a Republican primary if you change your views on sort of those things. If you don't say, don't look up, right? You're not going to end up being the standard bearer for the party in the general election. So it seems like there's some other moves. The other moves are convince people to hate Democrats, right? Including people who are lefties, right? Convince them to hate Democrats. Convince people just to have no hope, right? Just to buy IKEA furniture and, get on TikTok and, whatever, like live your life, but don't have any hope that collective change is possible. Convince them to not to vote. And what you said is even related to those things, but try to convince them there is no difference, right? And if you can block, if you're Mitch McConnell, if you're in Congress and you can block meaningful accomplishment, even if that meaningful accomplishment would seem useful in the short term to people's lives, or useful to your voters, or popular, pro-democracy legislation tends to be really popular. Anti-corruption legislation tends to be really popular. But if you can just block anything from happening, it sounds like, well, maybe then you can shave that number. How do you see the strategy or the competing strategies playing out with younger voters now?
Well, I think you really crystallized the strategy from the right in that overview, Jefferson. And the only thing I would add, which is, essentially, just kind of final point on this, is stoking fear, right? And expecting people to withdraw. However, that's backfiring, right? And rather than withdrawing, what we're seeing is a generation that is anything but snowflake, anything but melting. They have seen more trauma, more chaos in this short amount of time that they've been alive than any generation in 75 years, without the promise and hope of America's best. And instead of, again, withdrawing, they've decided to stand up and begin to kind of change the system. So the strategy, I think, for the right, as you indicated, isn't necessary to compete for the mainstream hearts and minds of this incredibly important generation. By the way, the ways in which George Bush did fairly well, in the 2000s. I mean, he received 45% of the vote against John Kerry, 2004. But instead, again, block and show ways in which the government doesn't work and try to sow distrust in media and institutions. On the other hand, the Democrats, I think, need to continue to kind of expand this electorate. You mentioned before your work around youth voter mobilization. It's challenging, right? They're not often watching the same media, consuming the same information as older groups of Americans. It's a challenge, especially a challenge for groups of Americans who don't have a regular history of participating in elections. So it's difficult, it's challenging, it's a puzzle almost every time. But the upside is enormous, right? When we can expand the franchise and build coalitions. I'm not sure that Joe Biden is president today, without young people. There are four.
Well, I think we do know. I think you do know that he's not president today, but for young voters.
Yes, I'm sorry. Did I? Yes.
You said you don't know if he's president today. I think you were being humble about it, and I think you are absolutely sure that, but for the delta among young voters, Joe Biden is not president.
Yeah. Listen. Perhaps I was being humble. I know politics is complicated, and there's a lot of kind of intersection, et cetera, right? But listen, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and in Michigan, okay, Joe Biden lost the vote of folks over the age of 45. And he won the youth vote, the under 30 vote by average of 20 points, and the 30 to 40 vote, by average of like 9 to 12 points in each of those states. So, and the same thing, frankly, goes for Georgia, the two Democratic senators in Georgia as well.
I'm borrowing this from a dear friend and former colleague. She would give me this quiz, and I'm not going to get the quiz perfectly. She said, describe the president who won by a significant, who came to office in the under the specter of war, who faced significant economic challenge, who then won by a margin among young voters bigger than any other president and bigger among young voters than any other demographic in those elections. There might have been another factor too. And then she said, what president am I talking about? And people would guess. And it was right after Obama had been elected. So he was almost always the first guess. So no, I think I'm in on your joke. And they would guess John Kennedy or whatever. And her answer was no, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That FDR voted in by huge majorities among young people. My point of bringing this up is that something is at stake more than 2022 or 2024. That those FDR young voters, those New Deal Democrats, were then Lyndon Baines Johnson Democrats. Those were Great Society Democrats. That built the era of sort of developing 20th century social justice infrastructure and building the public structures and kind of the modern state as we knew it, built the middle class as we knew it. And that was the dawn of that happened in a few elections in the early middle portion of the century. How much do you say, or how much do you think in terms of kind of a longitudinal look at this stuff? And how much do you think strategists are seeing this in a longitudinal look? It's like, if we lose this sector of voters a few times in a row, just doesn't mean we lose or win a couple of elections. It means maybe that lasts for a couple of decades or several.
I wish that more strategists thought like that, frankly. And in my experiences, we still have too much focus, honestly, on the next 3 months, 6 months, a handful of days between now in the next election, rather than investing in a generation of people who, as I said, have already done extraordinary things. There are dozens of places where they've already made a difference on gun violence. Dozens of places where they've already made a difference. After the protests for racial justice, Black Lives Matter, and George Floyd, and further empowering them could cement, kind of a Democratic majority in many, many, many battleground states. So, and we know that voting is a habit. The more likely you are to vote at 18, 19, 20, you'll continue that habit as you kind of get older. So, I wish there was, frankly, more of a longer view strategy and investment in young people, certainly by the Democratic Party. What I think, though, is that, as you said earlier, that Republicans are seeing that they have a fundamental kind of value misalignment, frankly. Younger people have consistently, we pull this every single spring, about a dozen, 15 or so issues. Every single spring, we're seeing this generation become just a couple of points more progressive every single year. The valuing kind of a robust government, certainly to help the vulnerable. And by the way, Jefferson, like those biggest spikes and changes came during the Trump years. It's essentially, if Trump was for it, they were against, or vice versa.
And it does make me think, right? Like Trump is now such a definitional piece, and people have heard me say before, like most of the Trump intellectual apparatus, if I can use that phrase without triggering too much tittering, was not born of that man, right? Like he didn't start the thing. He's not the head of the snake. He's a rattler. But at this point, he's become such a dominant force within the Republican Party, and so definitional for it. If you're a Republican strategist, how do you get them back? How do you get young voters back? Is it strictly by trying to say, Joe Biden's old, Kamala Harris is blank, Democrats suck, and there is no hope? Just go buy some IKEA furniture, or I don't know why I say IKEA. It could be any kind of furniture you want, I guess. But or do they have? There you go. Something more of the millennial era, of the online era. Something you buy on Zoom. What's the move you would make if you were a Republican strategist, or what do you see Republican strategists doing other than what we've already talked about?
The move, right? The move is to actually not listen necessarily to Gen Xers like me, but it's to actually go out into America and begin to have the conversation and listen to people, right? And say, what's on your mind? Before I have any focus group, and I talk a lot about, this book is not about charts and graphs and stats. A lot of it is like the human stories and the folks I met along the way. And whatever issue I talk about, public education, climate, gun violence, that's usually saved for the second part of the conversation. The first part is, tell me what it's like to be a young person today. What's on your mind? What makes you happy? What keeps you up at night? Okay. So until our elected officials, Democrats or Republicans, understand the day-to-day lives of someone, what stresses them out, I don't think we can have a conversation about a piece of policy or a piece of legislation or a piece of persuasion. There needs to be some trust developed. And the only way you can develop trust is to actually listen and engage. Democrats, Bernie Sanders has done wonders, I think, for Democrats in terms of listening to this economic stress and anxiety that was happening proved itself, a decade ago and Occupy, right? And kind of brought that to life to people. And there have been movements that follow that. But I don't think it's as simple as, privatizing this department or being for or against a certain piece of legislation. It has to start with understanding the stressors, the anxiety. I mean, there's a half of this generation, Jefferson, 52% have indicated that over the last several times in the last 2 weeks, they've had significant bouts of hopelessness or depression. Several times. 25% have indicated the same thing several times, to the point where it could lead to self-harm, or regretfully even worse. Okay, 6% are dealing with that every single day. So that's how you begin to develop a relationship by understanding those drivers. Yes, government can't solve everyone's problems, but understanding, listening, having some empathy, that's how you start.
So some of this seems to be pretty clear and not just about a few months or a few years or even about trying to figure out some new stuff we don't already know, but even we just listen to what we're all really aware of, right? We're all really aware that college is really expensive, right? And not just like I had this conversation with my brother with respect to my nephew who's just about to start applying to colleges, and our dad. All right, and our dad talks about how he put himself through school, and we both had to sort of kind of shout our dad down. I mean, in a loving way, right? Like no voices were raised, but sort of try to drill it into his very intelligent, but somewhat uh, predetermined brain that that's not a thing anymore, right? Like in the year I was born, uh, tuition at my law school, and I think I probably said this before because it's still one of my least favorite facts. Tuition at my law school is about the same as a plane trip across the Atlantic Ocean. So they're both about $1,000. Now, tuition at my law school, I think, is $60,000, right? And rising, right? It's tuition plus everything else, life expenses, is at $99,000. Why it's 99? Because I'm pretty sure they said they didn't want it to be 100, right? So they just try to keep the math down just below 100. Now, if you worked really hard over the summer and through the school year, and you could earn yourself, despite going through school, $25,000 a year. That's a lot to earn while you're going to school, right? That's a lot to earn. If you looked at what my dad earned, he probably did half that. Right? He worked really hard. He's a hardworking guy. He probably earned the equivalent of 12.5 now. But let's say he did even more than that. Right? He had a side hustle, a TikTok page, slung some stuff off Amazon, right? Like listened to Gary Vee and like went and got the chair and sold the chair to somebody next door, like really hard, or 25 grand, right? While going to school. They'd have a quarter of it done, right? And they'd still have to borrow $75,000 that year, and they'd have to do it 2 more times, right? So it just the old lessons just aren't a thing, right? And we can ask some, build trust to ask some millennials and some Gen Z members, like, how do you feel about this, or is that about right, or what am I missing? But I think we know that's true, and we just need to tell a bunch of people that's true, including every voter older than I am. Right, that even for me, right, when I went, we say, oh, tuition's really expensive. Somebody in my generation, we hear that, oh, tuition is really expensive. It's really expensive for me too. It's expensive different now, right? It's expensive different. For me, it was really expensive. It was the kind of debt that would take me several years, or take somebody of my era, several years to work off, maybe a bunch. Now it's total. But even moving across, because that's obvious stuff, right? Not every kid goes to college. Not every kid needs to go to college. But even we're just talking about owning a home. Like we know that it used to be that when my dad said, well, save the money for a down payment. Well, you can't get a house in my neighborhood for anywhere near my neighborhood for less than $500,000, right? Like you're not saving up the down payment for that house in like a year or two, right? Like you have to figure out how you're going to inherit some money, how you're going to steal some money, or have to be really popular on TikTok or get into multi-level marketing and then lose everything, right? In order to try to get that house. It's just the fundamental realities of how unfair economic system has become seems so palpably obvious that it makes me also want to go to the thing you said. To me, it is about hopelessness. That if I feel hopeless, then that yields indifference. And forgive the extreme example, but Hitler didn't win because the majority of people were Nazis. Hitler won because far too many people were indifferent. And if you can just have that learned helplessness, learned hopelessness, that seems like one of the great risks, because some of the policy answers seem sort of clear. How to feel free to respond to that. I've been on my soapbox a little while. I will now calm my voice.
I think one of the most interesting stats that I uncovered was similar to what you said about your dad. You were born in the 60s, 70s, or early 80s. You could literally work a summer job, 13 weeks without summer, minimum wage, and pay for a year of the average of all universities and colleges in America, public and private together. Okay, so that's what our parents and grandparents kind of were left with. And you're right. If I talk to dozens and dozens of people whose dream is to be a teacher, or to give back somewhere to their community, but they can't afford to live there, right? They can't afford that.
My brother's a teacher.
Dollar
He
house
can't. My
Yeah,
brother's a teacher. He can't afford to. Certainly cannot afford to own a home in the neighborhood school where we grew up. And to be clear,
right,
that when we grew up, it was not a wealthy neighborhood.
right. And what an economist will tell us is once you start in that hole, it's almost impossible to dig your way out of that hole, right? And what is I think so remarkable though. Of younger people and these Zoomers, yeah, they're concerned about this kind of economic inequality and the fact that they just have to have that side hustle or two, right, to get ahead. Constantly in focus groups, I hear this constantly, and that's just something relatively new, right? But it's difficult to get ahead. Now, what's happening though, I think, is they're going to kind of reshape what it means to be successful in life. And over the course of this book, when I outline of the drivers of the values that they've developed, I talk at the end about 10 predictions about how I think our lives will change. And I think I can kind of summarize it into 3 or 4 big categories: how we work, right? How we live and how we eat, and then how we measure success. And I'm confident that basically kind of our kids and their kids are going to be measuring success not by how much stuff they can buy, right, but how many friends and how many bonds that they can make, right? They're going to choose to work at one company over another company, not just based upon the overall compensation package, but based upon how good they feel about the company, right, and the social benefit of that. So they're gonna prize flexibility, and just completely change the dynamic because they have to, frankly, to survive, because it's not able to survive based upon the stats that you shared and that I uncovered in this book.
Presumably, when you were working on the book, there was stuff you were champing at the bit to say, right? It's like, I'm writing this book because I believe the following, or I now know the following to be true. Presumably, also in the preparation and the writing and the research, something surprised you. Let's do one of each. Let's start with something that you knew to start out. It's like when you were saying, I'm going to have to spend the next blank number of months working on this book. What was that? What was that core nugget that you most wanted to share with the world? Maybe it's something you already said, or maybe there's something that we've missed so far.
Most important thing I want to express is that everything that many of us thought about Gen Z was wrong, right? When I was writing this book, I started 3 years ago. Okay, I started 3 years ago with a proposal and began to do the right chapters. If you look at Google Trends for Snowflake, okay, that was how young people were portrayed. It was about wokeness and snowflakes and that sort of thing. And what I knew from talking to them and what I found and what I think I've proven throughout the course of this book is that they're anything but snowflakes, right? They are tougher, stronger, angrier, more motivated than any other group, I think, of Americans. And if you use the analogy of what's happening is they've actually gotten kind of harder and like almost like diamonds, not rather than snowflakes. So I wanted to kind of we talk about the resiliency and the fight. That's what I really wanted to get across. And honestly, you know, honestly, 2019 happened, 2020, and they continue to prove it over the course of my writing. So I changed chapters, to talk about race, in the light of what Darnella Fraser and her counterparts did around George Floyd. I had to talk about the 2020 election with what Ed Markey did in Massachusetts, what Biden did, et cetera. So the story was kind of developing, which was a lot of fun for me as I was writing it.
So I did I'm reminded of a couple things. One, that jibes with my wife's view. Her view is the next generation is going to save America. Her occasional view is also it's going to be too late then, or the democracy will have already had such threat. The climate will have already had such threat. The death spiral of greater and greater conglomeration of economic power will limit the sort of tools of real freedom, right? To make it even harder for when the youngest generation is in fact in power. Uh, we kind of go back and forth with that pessimism and that optimism. Uh, the toughness and resilience. I was just talking to the son of I don't have children. I was talking to the son of a friend of mine. And I was like, uh, and it was the same conversation I had with a daughter of a friend. So two daughters of a friend. So we had a woman who runs one of the leading Black community center in our town. We had big forest fires, big wildfires year before last. We had them again this year, but even worse year before last. And they were starting to approach their family home, right? And I got a call from a friend of mine. They said, "Do you know anybody, Jeff, with an Airbnb?" Because my colleague sort of is like almost not his direct report, but one of the senior people in his organization was literally in the parking lot of a shelter wondering where she was going to have her kids sleep. And I said, "Well, I don't have an Airbnb, but we're fixing up our house and nobody's living there yet. So she could stay in our, she could be the first people to sleep in our house." And so she did. And so I had to let him in. So I greeted him, and it was little thing, sort of easy thing to do to help some people who need some help. And I had a chance to talk to her daughters. And this is now at the beginning or earlier stages of COVID. Same conversation I had literally like 5 nights ago with the son of a friend and neighbor. And essentially, my summation of my part of the conversation was, don't let anybody my generation or older say, back in my day, we had it really hard because of blank, blank, and blank. No, you're the ones who had it hard, right? Like, yeah, not all of you have been conscripted to go serve in a foreign war, right? But you have had it hard. Of course they're going to be tough. How does some of that toughness manifest itself now, or how do you anticipate it manifesting itself?
So can I take one small step back?
Please,
put this into context, if that's okay. I want to kind of, we talked about this generation being born right around 9/11. Okay. So think about that. And by the time they are in elementary school, okay, red shooter drills, lockdown drills, school shootings, the one place that there was supposed to be security doesn't exist. We then move a couple years more into the Great Recession, where tens of millions of families lost their homes. Okay. 80% of America lost 20% of its wealth. Incredibly challenging time for young people, and we see mental health stressors to this day based upon children, especially young boys, raised during that time period. We then go from that point to that whiplash I talked about between no drama Obama to the kind of the chaos of Trump that we talked about a little bit. Add in opioid crisis, add in concerns about climate change, add in a faltering democracy, all before COVID, all before their 25th birthday. That's what this generation has dealt with. Other generations dealt with difficult things as well, but it's one of the toughest questions. One of the most challenging questions I can ask in a focus group is, tell me when you felt good about America. Tell me, your most favorite memory of being an American. And it's really challenging for people in their teens and their early 20s, because you take people a little bit older than that, and they remember watching TV in 2008 when the country seemed to come together during the Obama election. They remember that. I remember this time of year back in 1980, Miracle on Ice. I remember that. I remember how we came together after the tragedy of the Challenger disaster, after 9/11, et cetera. This young group of young people have chaos, tragedy, but they don't have that hope and that promise, right? So that's tough. That's tough.
Even some of the things that to me have felt like coming together moments for some people. Like you do write about the Parkland shooting. That's self-inflicted internal. I mean, that's not a victory, but it's also not a tragedy caused by a foreign power, right? I mean, if we're looking at January 6th, for instance, that's the enemy inside the house. So how do you anticipate that? How does that inform your predictions, right? If we imagine that I don't have this enthusiasm about my country because I haven't seen my country do things that I am as proud of as many times, or I don't associate with happiness. I didn't get to root in front of the TV for the moon landing, right? I didn't get to see John Glenn take off. Instead, I get to look on social media as yet another some number of dozen young people are gunned down unnecessarily. How does that inform your predictions?
Well, what's critically important, I think, is how our leaders, especially the White House and Congress, is communicating with younger people. Because, as I talked about earlier, they need to see the tangible difference. So they need to be reminded, frankly, that we can still do big things, right? That government does can play a positive role in society. And as Joe Biden talked about a week after Floyd's murder, that it's in the morning, in the grief, that America's biggest, that we've seen the greatest amount of progress. So we need to continue to reach out and to communicate and to empower younger people. Listen, 70% of the greatest generation, Jeff, participated in a significant way in World War II, right? Being back fascists, about 70%. And what I think all of us need to do is to essentially ask and encourage and empower, if not demand, that younger people vote or participate in politics at the same level as their great-grandparents, right? It took 70% of young Americans to beat back fascism. It's going to take 70% of young Americans, I think, to protect our democracy. If that happens in the midterm election and the election after that, it immediately makes America, in my opinion, a much better place. And what that means is that every young person needs to bring a friend. We had about 35% participate in the last midterm election. And if everyone brings a friend, someone who's not as engaged in politics, that's how we begin to change it real quick.
Well, I appreciate you taking this time. One other thing I want to cover before we wrap is your statement. Hopefully I'm quoting it accurately, that impatience is a virtue. Why do you use impatient as a term to describe Generation Z or Zoomers?
I really, that chapter is really kind of inspired by Greta Thunberg and her story, which is directly connected to the tragedy of Parkland. She was a frustrated little girl who had this incredible superpower, right, to see things that others can't see, to see the urgency of climate change, well ahead of most adults. But she won a school essay contest, but she started her school strike, but she wasn't able to really kind of garner any attention. And she really kind of, I think, kind of tapped into what she learned from studying David Hogg and Emma Gonzalez and others in Parkland, and began to just do it herself. And then one person and another person, teacher, other people began to join her. And what this generation has is this sense of urgency that I don't think exists even with their older, quote, brothers and sisters or cousins and millennials, right? And that they need to strike today. They need to take this opportunity when they have the microphone at this moment to empower people. That's that sense of urgency. This is a generation that grew up with DoorDash, right? With Siri. We talked about ordering furniture off of Wayfair. They're used to having everything come to them very, very quickly. So the political process designed to be deliberative just doesn't work for them as much. So impatience, I think, can be a virtue because they can demand things. If they're not seeing the kind of progress that they're looking for, I'm hopeful they'll continue to march, to protest, to vote, and to choose to support people, brands, candidates that reflect their values.
I think that spending more of our time and energy giving the next generation of leaders tools, not only motivation, but tools, skills, lessons they can borrow from, either cast aside or use for themselves, to make sure it's not just Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson who are talking to sort of next generation people trying to figure out how they're going to live their lives, what they can do. And that feels like an enormously important priority. You sounding, I don't know if it's an alarm, but sounding a bell about some of the elements of that, we hugely appreciate, and really appreciate the book and your calling for people to really hear these lessons. But John DeLa Volpe, Director of Polling at, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. I appreciate it. All right, take care.